Coming up on this episode, I'm joined by Austin McGee. He's the site expert of Pippen Ain't Easy. That's fan-sided Chicago Bulls site. He'll deliver us a Bulls perspective on the latest report that the Warriors are heavily interested in Nikola Vucevic. Is the two-time All-Stars production and shooting numbers this season real? How legitimate are the defensive concerns? And what will Chicago be asking for in a potential trade with the Warriors ahead of the February 6th deadline? If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252, that's POK252 on X/Twitter. You can also follow Austin at AustinMcGee15 on X/Twitter as well. Make sure to check out his work on Pippen Ain't Easy. And other than that, let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Austin. I was just saying to you off air that the amount of times that I've spoken about Nikola Vucevic on this podcast or on post-game live shows is I've lost count. We've been doing it for weeks and weeks, and I thought this was a great time to get you on the back of the report from The Athletic yesterday, which I quote, Nikola Vucevic has emerged as the most discussed Warriors trade target according to team and league sources. So to get a Bulls perspective on this is fantastic. So thanks for coming on. First of all,
Sure.
Just on Chicago overall at the moment, big win over the Knicks yesterday. They moved to 16-19 on the season. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the level of motivation for them to deal Vucevic, Zach LaVine, Lonzo Ball, all these veteran pieces, because we've seen Brooklyn over the last couple of weeks. They probably took unders, you would say, for Dennis Schroeder and Dorian Finney-Smith. Didn't get any first-round picks for them, just seconds, and I think they did that because they knew they had to get off their veteran guys in order to further the tank. What's the current state of things in Chicago at the moment?
Yeah, so I definitely want to preface by saying that as a lot of, I guess, NBA fans, a lot of people know that Chicago's first rounder this year, if it falls out of the top 10, it's going to convey over to the San Antonio Spurs. So really, Chicago's kind of falling in between that perspective of are we going to tank? Do we want this first rounder? Which, I mean, from my perspective, I'd say definitely that's something that they need to prioritize. However, the East, obviously, it's a lot weaker than the West. So there's always going to be that opposing argument of, hey, let's, I mean, we're 16-19 right now. We're on the cusp of being decent, even average above average in the East. So why not just keep competing and let's earn that playoff spot? Could even be like a 6th or 7th seed even. So that's really where that conundrum falls right now. So there is motivation. However, it's just kind of at that teetering point, which I would definitely say, let's start this rebuild. But of course, from a fan's perspective or from the front office, it's like, let's compete as well.
Yeah, I feel like it's really interesting because the Bulls, to me, have been a team for so many years now that have just been stuck in the middle, not really going anywhere. Again, in the same spot they are right now, where they're anywhere between 7 and 10 in the East. They are battling for a playoff spot, but let's be honest, they're not in any level of championship contention. And then obviously to get back to that point, ultimately it's probably going to take a few steps backwards, a little bit of tanking, try and get some prospects in there that can obviously take you forward. So it is a really interesting point they're at right now, but they're going to have to make a decision now over the next month before the deadline. Let's get on to Nikola Vucevic specifically, because that's what we're here to talk about from a Warriors and a Bulls perspective. So he's currently averaging over 20 points, over 10 rebounds, over 3 assists. The efficiency is absolutely unreal at the moment. How real are those numbers? Because I think there's a little bit of, as much as Warrior fans are very interested and keen in Nikola Vucevic, there is, I think, a little bit of a worry on, okay, is this guy just going to go back to, the previous year's numbers from 3-point range, which haven't been good? I think it's like 34.9, 31.2, and 29.4% from three. He's now at 43.6% from 3-point range this season. Like, how real are these numbers from Nikola Vucevic at the moment, do you think?
Mm-hmm. So first, you mentioned the the 2010 and 3. So yeah, that's all very real. So he's been a pretty consistent contributor as far as around that 20 points per game, 10 rebounds, 3 assists. He's definitely a good low post threat. Something that Golden State, I know, hasn't really had in the past few years. So that's definitely like an added bonus there. good post player, uses pretty good footwork, good touch. The shooting, though, which you mentioned there, especially with the past few seasons, how low it's been. And I did a little article yesterday or the day before about his true shooting percentage was like 170th of 190 qualified players last season. This season, it's like 13. So pretty big difference there. And it's one thing I've seen some people point out is DeRozan being gone. Obviously, might help things a little bit just because he's obviously a mid-range player, creates his own shot off the dribble. And I've seen a little bit of that correlation there with the Kings. I saw Keegan Murray's dip in three-point field goal percentage is pretty alarming too. But I did some research too about Vooch and his open looks and what that looks like. Pretty, a pretty serious difference. He's getting around the same amount of open catch and shoot threes. All his threes are going to be wide open. He's not going to shoot any closely contested threes, anything like that. However, the percentage increase is just a drastic difference. It's like 43, 44%, even 45. It might be on those wide open three-pointers, so like 6 feet difference. As opposed to last year's like 29%. So something pretty crazy. I know the Bulls are playing at a much more upbeat pace, flying around. Josh Giddey's added to that a little bit too. So it's more of a spaced, fast break style oriented offense, which has helped. But it would definitely be, I wouldn't be like the least bit surprised if that percentage sunk down to maybe like 35, 36 upon a trade. Just for the fact that he might not be as comfortable in the Warriors offense as he is in the Bulls new offense this season.
Yeah. I think Warrior fans, part of the concern might be because of Dennis Schroeder. Like we saw him in Brooklyn, 18.7 points, like nearly 7 assists, 38.7%, I think, from 3-point range in his first 20-25 games or whatever it was of the season with the Nets. And now he's come to the Warriors, and I'm not sure what he is after yesterday's game, but he was shooting under 30% from the field and 20% from 3-point range. So it does go to show you the impact that coming to a new organization can have. But I think there is obviously the optimism with those numbers you've just pointed out on how wide open Vooch has been this season, because I do think he would get a lot of wide open looks with the Warriors. I think part of the frustration for Golden State fans is the amount of times that, Steph or Schroeder or whoever it is comes off a pick and either TJD or in the past Looney, they're kind of hanging around top of the arc and they're obviously not shooting threats and they're just wide open. And if you just chuck Vucevic into that spot, then all of a sudden he can fire away from that distance and be a real threat there, as opposed to Looney or TJD, where you basically have to then run another action to try and get another look, because those guys, they're not just not three-point shooting threats, they're not threats, particularly Trace Jackson-Davis. He's not a threat beyond the paint or even the restricted circle, you would say. So to have a guy like Vucevic, and even with his, you spoke about before, his touch around the rim, that's something that Trace Jackson-Davis really struggles with. Warrior fans have been quite frustrated with his lack of finishing ability so far this season. So the trade-off to Vucevic is obviously the defensive concerns, and that's obviously another big worry for Warrior fans. How legitimate are those, and how much do you think, like, obviously I've spoke about in the past, and The Athletic in their article yesterday mentioned, playing alongside Draymond Green, perhaps that could alleviate some of those defensive concerns.
So, yeah, they're definitely legitimate concerns. We know at 34 years old, never been a fantastic or long athlete. So, that's definitely going to play a part in his subpar defensive metrics. He's never really been like a plus defender at any stop in his career. But that doesn't mean he's not like a smart team defender. So that's the thing with Golden State, playing alongside Draymond Green is going to help too. So, I mean, he's averaging, it was like 0.8 steals, 0.6 blocks. So at least it's over like a stock a game. But, he's not going to be like a difference maker if someone's driving to the rim, anything like that. But, I mean, he hustles, he tries on the defensive end, and he's a good defensive rebounder too. So that's something that not a lot of people are going to take into account as far as like any defenders goes. Just going to look at blocks, things like that. So he's not going to pile up a lot of blocks, but I mean, similar to Trace Jackson-Davis as far as as far as he is with his defensive capabilities. Vooch is like a tad bit taller. The weight, it seems close, but I feel like Vooch is a little stockier. So he's going to be decent there. But I mean, like, just looking from a Bulls perspective, a lot of people are probably like, oh yeah, AO, the Sunmu, he's a pretty good defender. If you look at the metrics a little bit closer, his on-off splits are like pretty bad. Like the Bulls are a lot better defensively when he's off the floor. Vooch, it's similar, but that's more of just a testament to how bad the Bulls have been defensively this year. But with Draymond, obviously, it's going to help a lot. And the Warriors defense is pretty good in general. So I don't expect it to be like, you had Vooch and their defense is suddenly going to fall off a cliff. I think it's probably going to be pretty similar. And the rebounding and, I mean, he's 6'10", so, he can guard some of those bigger guys like Jokic. Obviously, Draymond's probably going to be the guy defending him, but he's going to be like a quick stopgap option for like a couple minutes if Draymond's not on the court.
Yeah. I am super interested to see, like, obviously we're getting a bit of it ahead of ourselves because the trade hasn't even happened now. But if Vucevic did go to the Warriors, like, I'm really interested to see the split. Let's say it was like Looney going to the Bulls, so he's no longer in the equation. He's out of the rotation at the moment anyway. You've got TJD, you've got Vucevic, you've got Draymond as the small ball 5 option. I'm really fascinated to see how many minutes Vucevic would actually play because he is this like former 2-time All-Star and he's putting up 20, 10, and 3 on great efficiency right now. But I think there's some Warrior fans, and perhaps myself included, who think that come playoff time, like his defensive concerns will be at such a point that he might only play like 20 minutes a game. And then you might have to throw Trace out 15, and then maybe your best lineup still Draymond small ball 5 for like 15 minutes a game. So the other thing that worries me is like I go through his numbers and the guy just doesn't make the playoffs throughout his entire career. And that's a worry for me in terms of, okay, how much of is he a winning player? And then come playoff time, like he just actually really lacks playoff experience. If I had to like ask you, do you think he's on a reasonable playoff team who's at least trying to win a round or two, is he going to be that 30-minute per game player for you? Or is there a genuine possibility that he's like 18 to 20 minutes and the defensive concerns are that much that you're going to be limited to playing him that kind of playing time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Like the first thing that pops up in my head too with the Warriors is kind of like a David Lee type presence, like back in the mid 2010s. Could be something along the lines of that in the postseason. I remember there's one postseason where he was like a 20 or like a 10 to 20 minute guy instead of like that usual starting role. It could be something similar to Vooch. The thing is though, at least he does add that perimeter marksmanship, at least this season, that adds to his value. However, like I mentioned at the start, it's an interesting question because he has such a lack of playoff experience for a 34-year-old 2-time All-Star. So that's definitely something to ponder. It's kind of puzzling that he hasn't had more, but he has been a part of some bad teams with the 76ers at the start to the Magic, and obviously the Magic are just getting good now again, but and on the Bulls most recently. So it would really be kind of like just go out there and test, see how good a Draymond and Vooch front court does. And, if those defensive problems occur, or if they're playing a team, the Warriors, that is, if they're playing a team with a pretty good center, or maybe like a team that doesn't have a 5 that's out there. Like if they're playing the Mavericks and it's like a Lively or Gafford type front court, yeah, you could probably play Vucevic. He can defend one of those guys out there for the majority of the game. But if it's the Thunder and maybe it's like Chet at the 5 who they're playing, and it's like he's bringing them out to the 3-point line. He has a capability of driving and kicking, just kind of making it an awkward situation for Vucevic. That might be where he's kind of like that 18 to 20 to 25 minute even type of guy. Might not even be a closer in that sense. So there are some concerns there too about what his usage would look like. And that almost is more so like, let's test this guy. Let's see like what Giddey was like in the first round when he was getting 20 something, 30 minutes with the Thunder last year. And then against the Mavericks, his lack of shooting just really hurt. So he was 10 to 15 minutes. So it would kind of be like a plug and play scenario, I would say.
Yeah, okay. It's really interesting to hear you talk about the defensive stuff there. It sounds like if he's coming up against just paint guys who aren't going to stretch the floor or whatever, he might be okay. But his bigger issues come when he's forced to get out onto the perimeter, whether it's closing out to guys like himself who can actually shoot the ball from range, or whether he's asked to switch onto guys, which the Warriors do switch a bit. And I think it's something like Kevon Looney, even though he doesn't seem like a great athlete by any means, he's often historically, like, going back years and years, like to the kind of Rockets matchups where he used to like have to guard Harden sometimes.
Mhm.
And again, even though he's not an elite athlete by any means, he actually did a pretty good job switching out onto smaller guys and onto guards. And that's where, something that sounds like Vucevic might struggle with. Moving on to like the trade aspect of it and what the Bulls foreseeably want from the Warriors, or would want in any deal with any team right now for Nikola Vucevic. I read your article yesterday after the report, and you specifically mentioned Moses Moody and Chicago's potential interest in him. Did you want to just dive into that a little bit more for me, and the potential interest around Moses Moody? I know with his poison pill contract at the moment, it would be somewhat difficult to have him included in the deal, but is that the young prospect that if you're Chicago, you'd be targeting?
I would say so. And the reason I did point out Moody is I've always felt from an outsider's perspective that his positioning in Steve Kerr's rotations, it's been a little bit odd how he has really been like 13 to 18 minutes kind of in between in there. I know he's still really young. He came out of college at like 18 or 19 when he was drafted. So I think he's only 22 right now, right?
Yeah, correct.
So it's definitely a good prospect to go after, just for the fact that since he is still such a young age, that there's still potential. I know the Bulls are really reliant upon offense first guards and forwards right now. So it might not be like the best pairing, but I would say any trade involving Vooch or Levine, since Vooch is 34, Levine's about to turn 30 in a couple months, it would be targeting a young prospect. Like a couple months ago, I mentioned that I would prefer like a Nick Claxton, a Walker Kessler, or something like that in a Chicago jersey, just because they'd be like a rim protecting threat, something that the Bulls haven't had in a while. So that would be kind of like the first thing. But if it's the Warriors, obviously that's not a candidate on the entire roster. Someone that could average like 2 blocks a game or something like that, like a long and lanky athlete. So I would say if there is anyone, it would be someone like Moody. And you mentioned the poison pill with his rookie scale extension that he signed in the offseason. Luckily, it's not one of those like 5-year, 150 million type deals that he signed.
Yeah.
So that does help. Since it's like it was like a 3-year, 39 million extension. So that's going to kick in next year. So instead of having to account for like an extra 25 million or something, it would just be kind of that range. And Vucevic is up for 20 million this season, 21 million next. So that actually does kind of help on the trade front, but it is still something to think about if the Bulls are going to say, hey, let's go after, we want draft compensation. We don't care, or are looking for like another young offensive oriented guard or wing. So that's definitely in the equation. Just kind of mention that. Maybe I'd also kind of like to get your perspective on like the Kyle Anderson thing. If he's someone you think the Warriors are going to be holding on to going forward, or more so a player that they could just tack on to like a young guy like Moody to get someone like Vucevic in the trade.
Yeah, it's a good point you mentioned, because I know you mentioned Anderson in your article yesterday as well. It's really funny because if you asked me 24 hours ago, I said, yeah, he'd absolutely be involved in a Vucevic trade or some kind of deal before the deadline. And it's crazy how these things work within within the space of 24 hours. Jonathan Kuminga goes down with a pretty concerning ankle injury, which at the time of this recording, we're still trying to work out how significant that is. Steve Kerr did say it was significant in his post-game press conference, but we haven't heard anything in terms of a timetable or anything like that. He goes down in the first half yesterday. Kyle Anderson comes out, plays over 21 minutes, which he hadn't played 20 minutes in a game since November 10, so nearly 2 months. He'd been a DNP in 5 of the last 9 games. And so it really was getting to a situation where, okay, if Steve's just not going to utilize this guy, then he needs to be involved in trade talks, because there's no point having a guy making 8 to 9 million this season who's out of the rotation completely. But now all of a sudden, Kuminga's probably going to be gone for a couple of weeks here. All of a sudden, you need Kyle Anderson pretty badly. He played 10.5 minutes in the fourth quarter yesterday and was good against a pretty decent team, and the Warriors got the win. So I think a lot of Warrior fans are very much of the idea that this guy is still a very valuable rotation player. And I think if you asked the majority of Golden State fans, they would say he should be in the rotation. Like, regardless of whether Kuminga's injured or not, he should be in the rotation. He's a valuable piece. He's a very Warrior style of player. And now all of a sudden, again, his value to the Warriors has skyrocketed in the last 24 hours because of the Kuminga injury. So I guess from a Chicago perspective as well, I'm assuming you'd want expiring money, not long-term money. Like, Kyle Anderson is still on, well, it's just, this is the first year of a 3-year, $27 million deal. And so I suppose from a Bulls perspective, if I was the front office trying to talk myself into it, I would say that Kyle Anderson, I think, is still a good player. And the fact that he hasn't been playing for the Warriors, I don't think that's about him necessarily. I think there's probably some inside political stuff going on with particularly trying to get Kuminga 30, 35 minutes a game, and that's got to come off someone else. So if I'm the Bulls front office, I'm probably trying to talk myself into, okay, we can get Kyle Anderson. Maybe he plays the rest of the season with us and, shows up, plays really well. And then in the off season, he could actually be an asset for you where you could go and get a second round pick. Like, I think you could get off that contract pretty comfortably. And I think, like, for another playoff team, he could be a legitimate, valuable piece that they will just, go to you and say, yep, here's a second round pick. And so you could get off that money. So I'm not sure that's a huge concern, but I do appreciate that. I'm sure the Bulls would rather say, all right, let's get Gary Payton II on $9.1 million expiring deal, Kevon Looney on $8 million expiring deal. Now, that gets you to 17.1. Obviously, there's something else that has to be included in there. Maybe it's Moody, and that's the way it works. Anderson possibly as well on top of those two guys. Maybe it's Buddy Hield, who's, not had a great last 6 weeks or so after such a hot start to the season. I think the Warriors, I still think there's still a lack of shooting on the roster. I still think that they need Buddy Hield to some degree, so I doubt they'd put him in a trade. And again, from a Bulls perspective, Buddy Hield's on this weird 4-year, $37 million contract, but there's like player options and team options in the third and fourth years. Like, it's a bit of a strange deal. So yeah, I don't know. Like, I think the deal that I've proposed previously is like Peyton and Looney and Moody, and then if you need to get a third team involved, that takes, well, I don't know, because it sounds like you want Moody from a Bulls perspective. So it's still a little bit complicated. I don't know if you've jumped on the trade machine and you've done anything. You've got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've definitely been on the trade machine quite frequently recently, just kicking around, especially with the Warriors, kicking around like Moody, Anderson, Gary Payton, Looney too. Haven't really thrown Hield in there because I'm not sure if that's someone that Chicago would want. I know his contract lines up quite well, but I know he's kind of like a weird case because he's good in certain circumstances. I know he kind of like fell out of the 76ers rotation and had like that big playoff game, so it's kind of weird with him. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely something like expiring deals are going to be some of the best contracts to go after, like Looney, Gary Payton. So I was kind of throwing Moody in there too, to see what that would look like. And also, Chicago does have a few smaller contracts, so they have quite a bit of flexibility in there to work with too. Javon Carter, he randomly makes about like $6 million. So, I mean, he's been out of the rotation basically all this year and the latter half of last year. So he's another player they could throw in there. Then a couple minimum level guys like Tory Craig, who's really a sought after veteran 3-and-D guy on the trade market, who I absolutely expect the Bulls to trade. over the next up until the trade deadline. He's probably the guy I'd expect to be out even over Vooch. But yeah, it is really just those guys from the Warriors I've looked at. And then if perhaps like Moody wasn't included, I would think that the Bulls are definitely looking for a first rounder. Last season, if it was when Vooch was averaging about 20 and 10, but he was shooting like 47% or whatever from the field and like 28 or 29 from three, however bad he was shooting last season, I'd expect the Bulls to just be like, okay, we'll get away with like a couple second rounders in exchange for this guy, even though he's a two-time All-Star, 20 and 10 guy. That shooting percentage is just so low, and he's a defensive liability. So it's not like we're going to be able to get more out of him. But this season, holding on to him, he's playing so well. I think Chicago is really looking for a first rounder this time around for Vooch and definitely LaVine.
Yeah. So do you fully if Vucevic does get traded and let's say there's not a young prospect in there, you fully expect it will take a first round pick, even though like we've seen Mark Stein report in the last couple of weeks that they might not be able to get that in this market. We've seen Finney-Smith and Schroeder just go for seconds. Like you fully expect that there won't be a deal done unless it involves a first round pick or a young prospect.
So from Chicago's perspective, yeah, I do. It honestly might be better just to take a couple second rounders or something like that for him. But just getting a feeling of what the Bulls have done the past few years, just being really stingy with who they're trading, even Caruso. There's a report that the Warriors were looking at dealing a first rounder for him. And I know it's tough to compare players like Vooch and Caruso, whereas Caruso, he's going to be like 7-8 points a game, a couple of rebounds, a couple of assists, but he just provides so much value on defense, and he's like a low usage guy, which some teams even prefer. Whereas Nikola's a two-time All-Star, 20 and 10, can knock down threes, good post player. Those values are difficult to compare. But I do believe that Chicago has been holding out for a first rounder or a young prospect for him. So that's really the conundrum they continue to face, especially leading up to the deadline. So I think that even if they don't like the offers they're receiving, they could hold on to him throughout this season and into the offseason to potentially trade him where the salary caps it's easier to trade in the offseason, of course, with some teams, losing contracts and being able to acquire more in salary that they can send out.
And he's going to be expiring as well, he's got one more year.
Adds more value.
21.5 million or whatever else, which is interesting. Just back to Tory Craig for a second, because he's a player I think the Warriors might have had interest in previously in free agency, I think before he signed his 2-year deal with the Bulls or whatever it was. Is he like, how much value does he add to the trade? Like, is it a case of, he's the money we need to make it work, or is it a case of, no, you'd actually have to give up, I don't know, maybe is it a first round pick? Maybe that gets you Vucevic and Tory Craig. Obviously, we're talking about first round picks, and first round picks aren't created equal when you talk about all the different protections you can put on them as well. So I'm fascinated to know, because I think if the Warriors were sending out Gary Payton, then I think Tory Craig would be a player that I would be very, very interested in the Warriors acquiring, because of he's basically maybe another version of GP2, just slightly bigger and probably a better three-point shooter as well.
Yeah, so he has a ton of value, and it's just because his contract. So I know a lot of the second apron teams have been inquiring about some of those minimum level guys just to add value to their current rosters, because, like the Suns have no wiggle room. Timberwolves and Knicks, even like in the same boat, they're not going to be able to get really like an above average guy in the trade deadline to help their chances come playoff time. I know the Suns are really struggling right now, and it is partly because of lack of depth. So I know they would be interested in a guy like Tory Craig, just because he fits multiple boxes. He's a good defender. He can knock down open threes, good veteran, and something about him too, even though he's 34, he doesn't have like too much mileage on him. So he hasn't been one of those guys that's played, I think he's probably played less than 600 games even. So he hasn't played like 1,000 games. His career's almost over. He could probably go for a couple more years and still add some value. So that is something interesting that Tory Craig does provide. Like he's not playing at all for the Bulls, but he could be a rotation player for like Timberwolves who run like 8 deep, or the Suns who have had to expand who they've used recently because of injuries. But I mean, come playoff time, they're going to be 8, 9 deep at most. So with Craig, I mean, if the Warriors are like, yeah, we'll send you first rounder, but we want Tory Craig in the deal just to take over Gary Payton's minutes, then Bulls are going to be like, yeah, definitely, we'll throw Tory Craig in there as long as we get that first rounder back alongside Vucevic. So that is where he comes into play, and his contract is just so easy to include in any trade because it is the minimum, that it is makes him one of the easiest players on the team to part with, and probably the most accessible league-wide.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about, because he's certainly a player, as I said before, he's a player I think the Warriors should have some interest in if they're talking to the Bulls about Vucevic. All right, before we finish up, we need the final answer. In your heart of hearts, personal opinion, do you think Nikola Vucevic gets traded here, or what percentage do you want to put on it before the deadline?
Yeah, really good question there, because it's so tough to tell with the Bulls, because I know last year, I mean, everyone knows they've been like everyone's, yeah, trade Levine, trade DeMar DeRozan, trade Caruso, and then they've held on to them for so long. Um, with the trades of DeRozan and Caruso last offseason, it looks like Chicago is a little bit more willing to finally hit that rebuild button and start utilizing higher draft picks to start from scratch. So I do think it is somewhat likely, and I could very well see the Warriors actually acquiring Vooch come the February 6th deadline. So I would say it's probably anywhere from like 50 to 75% he could be traded, just because he is playing so well. His value seems to be peaking right now. I know in the off season could even be a little bit better because that deal is truly expiring. But I mean, a year and a half of a guy who's playing very well and shooting above 40% from three, I would say that's a pretty good steal. So if the value, if Chicago feels the value is right, and if a first rounder is dangled, I would say the Bulls are definitely going to make a trade and hit that rebuild button and actually, be able to pick in the top 10 of this draft, something that they haven't been able to pick in the top 10 since Patrick Williams a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's super interesting because you mentioned like the expiring contract in the offseason, and that's why I think it's such a low risk move for the Warriors, is that they could get him before the deadline and then see how it goes for the rest of the season. And if they truly don't like him, if they don't think he's a fit in the system, if the defensive concerns are too much, then that's going to be a $21.5 million expiring contract, which the Warriors could go out and, if a star player becomes available making $30-40 million or something like that, then they could use, that could be a pretty significant salary on top of the young players, on top of the draft picks, whatever else that they could use to go and just move Vucevic for a better player in the offseason. So I think the best thing about the Warriors and potentially getting Vucevic is that it still retains the flexibility. Now, maybe they do need to give up a first-round pick, but they've got like 7, right? So they can go and use other first-round picks and other moves, and perhaps, again, Vucevic is involved in that. Just like, a lot of Warrior fans at the moment are talking about the potential of Dennis Schroeder getting moved on February 5, where obviously that's less than 2 months after we just acquired him.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it does provide you that flexibility. It does sound like what you're saying with the Bulls, just to finish up here, it does sound like you're saying they are fairly stingy. And so would you say that a deal is more likely in the final 24 hours before the deadline, more so than, hey, we could see something in the next 2 weeks here?
Definitely be. I know they really are looking to get value out of both Vooch and Levine. So I could see it coming down to a trade deadline, leading up to the hour that the deadline is, like 2 or 3, whatever it is, and the time over here, Eastern time, whatever. I feel like that could come down to the wire, just because it is that they aren't going to be, they're going to be adamant. There's going to be either a young prospect or like a first round involved. And if it is, their options are only limited to a couple of second rounders. Could still be done because I think that would be beneficial in the long run, especially helping them lose some more games in the second half of the season and retaining that top 10 pick. But with just what history tells us, it could be something that they are going to be patient. They're going to wait for the right offer, kind of a different method that we've seen from the Nets. Just kind of getting rid of everyone, every decent player in exchange for some draft picks so they can actually tank because they've been better than advertised this season. So I think their mode of operations are a lot more clear than what the Bulls has been.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Fascinating stuff. Great to have you on, Austin, to give a Chicago perspective on all this stuff. Great to have you on. Hopefully, might be able to have you on again in the immediate aftermath of a trade, potentially in the next month or so.
For sure. Yeah. Definitely love to join you again.
Fantastic. Thank you.